On bended knee to Netanyahu. Despite Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu's in-your-face attempts to sabotage President Obama's foreign policy, official Washington's liberal establishment is on bended knee in an obsequious show of obeisance, apparently in line with Hillary Clinton's political wishes, writes ex-CIA analyst Paul R. Pillar. By Paul R. Pillar, November 8, 2015. Information Clearinghouse. On the eve of a visit by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to Washington, we have gotten yet another of the statements from members of his government that are sufficiently unrestrained or unhinged to cause a flap both in the United States and Israel. While Netanyahu's own comment about the Holocaust being a Palestinian idea is still fresh in our minds, Jesus, that I would even have to read something so ridiculous. The man is a freaking moron. Christ. The latest ear-catching remarks come from Ran Baratz, an inhabitant of a West Bank settlement from whom Netanyahu has chosen to be chief of Hasbara, the selling of Israeli policies overseas. Baratz has posted a trail of entries on Facebook that have insulted, among others, President Rivlin of Israel, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry, he's taking the easy pot shots, is he? Whom Baratz says has the mental capacity of a 12-year-old. Well, that does sound perfectly accurate. And President Obama, whom he accuses of being anti-Semitic. Netanyahu has reacted to the flap by saying that these postings did not represent the views of his government and that he will be reviewing the appointment of Baratz. But whether Baratz keeps or loses the job of chief propagandist doesn't really matter. The backtracking that customarily follows these sorts of Israeli comments, including Netanyahu's sort of retraction of his assertion about the origin of the Holocaust, again, the man is an idiot, are less representative of what this Israeli government is about than were the original comments. The government's insulting or embarrassing of senior U.S. officials is nothing new and has happened repeatedly in the past, such as when it announced new construction of settlements in East Jerusalem while Vice President Joe Biden was visiting Israel. The playing of the anti-Semitism card as a response to criticism of Israeli government policy is habitual on the part of not only the Israeli government but also some of its most loyal supporters in the United States. Throughout the history of Netanyahu occasionally being pushed into saying something that could be interpreted as support for a Palestinian state, his more genuine statements, as indicated by their consistency with his actual policies, have come when he has not been pushed, such as his statement, most recently, that he intended to, quote, control all of the territory and, quote, live forever by the sword. Yeah, good luck with that, fucktard. Rather than seeing a meaningless retraction or apology or mouthing of words we would like to hear, we should accept the original statements for what they are and not try to pretend that they were some sort of slip of the tongue. Statements that denigrate others may not be a slip at all, but rather part of a pattern of shifting blame, even when a particular accusation is patently false. There is the pattern of placing all blame for the violence and endless continuation of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on Palestinians, even when this includes asserting that Palestinians in general have genocidal aspirations. There is the pattern of attributing opposition to Israeli policies to ethnic bias, even when this includes calling Barack Obama an anti-Jewish bigot. Statements that refer to Israel's own intentions should be taken as truthful and not as a slip when they reflect Israel's actual policies and practices on the ground. This certainly is true of a statement by the Israeli Prime Minister expressing his intention to cling forever to the occupied territories, using military force as necessary to do so. There will be much evaluation of Netanyahu's meetings in Washington in terms of whether frictions between the two governments have been smoothed over, at least as far as the public face that they present is concerned. There already has been much commentary ahead of the visit that has essentially adopted that standard for assessing the meetings, but the kumbaya scale is not the right means for measuring success or failure of the visit, and harmonious U.S.-Israeli relations per se do not have value. Harmony is valuable only if it advances U.S. interests. Pretending there is more harmony of interests than there really is only obscures and confuses the diplomatic work that can and should be done. Such pretending also carries the additional disadvantage for the United States of associating it all the more closely with the actions of the other party in the relationship, including actions that are contrary to U.S. interests and that the rest of the world understandably condemns. As with any bilateral relationship, being honest about differing interests and objectives provides an accurate basis on which to address problems that need to be addressed. It also clarifies where there are truly convergent interests that can be the basis of mutually beneficial cooperation. Major, substantial differences exist between U.S. interests and Israeli interests, at least given how the latter are defined by the current Israeli government. The differences were in full display with the strenuous efforts by Netanyahu's government to sabotage a major U.S. foreign policy priority, the multilateral agreement to restrict Iran's nuclear program. The underlying difference on that issue was between, on one hand, the U.S. interest in using all available diplomatic tools to pursue non-proliferation and other goals consistent with improving regional stability, and on the other hand, the Netanyahu government's objective of keeping a competitor for regional influence isolated and maintaining conflict with Iran as a bête noire in perpetuity. Certainly, major differences of interest also persist regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, more generally the gulf between the United States and Israel has grown even wider insofar as Israel, including the territory it occupies, has become an increasingly intolerant place in which civil and political rights are apportioned accordingly to ethnicity and religious belief. Well, okay. About the best outcome from this U.S. standpoint, which is the standpoint that ought to matter to Americans, of Netanyahu's meetings that could reasonably be expected given the circumstances, would be for the two sides to issue a communique saying that they had a, quote, frank, businesslike exchange of views. That is the sort of language that typically describes dialogue between governments with major differences that nonetheless are willing to talk honestly about those differences and to explore ways of possibly reducing them. The public statements that actually will come out of the meetings probably will sound much more kumbaya-like than that. Netanyahu has a strong interest in making it appear that, despite all the attempted sabotage of U.S. policy and the pokes in U.S. eyes, his government is in good graces in Washington. We are all familiar with the realities of U.S. politics that lead players in the United States to go along with him in maintaining such an appearance. With this month's visit, even a paragon of the liberal establishment such as the Center for American Progress is welcoming Netanyahu into its spaces despite all his blatant interference in U.S. policies in a direction opposed to what CAP stands for. That decision probably has mostly to do with how Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign sees its near-term interests, but that is distinctly different from the interests of the United States, and even over the long term and looking beyond the current government and interests of Israel. The Pentagon's Empire of Whining by Pepe Escobar, November 9, 2015, Asia Times, on informationclearinghouse.info. After 8 days traveling in Asia, Ash hit the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library in Simi Valley, California, sounding like a stray ballistic Whining missile. And he hit where it hurts, the Russia-China Strategic Partnership. How dare they? Don't you step on my blue Pentagon shoes. So Russia is guilty of undertaking, quote, challenging activities at sea, in the air, in space, and in cyberspace. Not to mention, quote, nuclear saber rattling. Ash once again enumerated all those, quote, pillars of the international order that Russia-China are allegedly violating. Peaceful resolution of disputes, freedom from coercion, respect for state sovereignty, and freedom of navigation. Considering Exceptionalistan's recent record in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, and myriad assorted latitudes, one can always count on the Pentagon to bolster the annals of hyper-unrealism. Dr. NATO Supremo General Philip Breedlove had already blurted out on the record he has no clue what Putin is up to in Syria. Ash, his boss, doubled down. Putin, quote, hasn't thought through very thoroughly his objectives in Syria, and his approach is, quote, way off track. Certainly, because 1 month of Russian airstrikes did way more to debilitate ISIS, Daesh, than over a year of the, quote, track, followed by the coalition of the dodgy opportunists, CDO, led by the U.S. and featuring Salafi jihadi, quote, moderate rebel enablers, such as Turkey and Saudi Arabia. Ash deviated from Whining just to concede it's, quote, possible that, quote, Russia may play a constructive role in resolving the civil war in Syria. He wouldn't elaborate on, quote, constructive. Then back to a non-denial denial. Quote, we do not seek a cold, let alone a hot war with Russia. We do not seek to make Russia an enemy. And yet, Cold War 2.0 is actually in effect since Maidan in Kiev, and the hysterical demonization campaign of both Putin and Russia shows no signs of abating. Earlier last week, Ash was aboard a U.S. aircraft carrier in the South China Sea, demonstrating commitment to, quote, freedom of navigation, as in, quote, our naval way or the highway. Beijing not so much reacted, but floated, with Chinese subtlety, that any fooling around would come with a price. What about feeling the love of the DF-21D carrier killer ballistic missile with a 2,500 kilometer range? Yeah, Ash Carter was aboard the aircraft carrier. Does it seem to anyone else that somebody would have been trying to get him killed? On China, Ash once again displayed Pentagon half-baked Orientalist condescending. It all depends on, quote, how China behaves when demonstrating commitments to peace and security. Expect Ash's Whining missiles to proliferate unchecked. They're embedded in the new U.S. military doctrine which ranks Russia and China, with Iran a not-so-distant third, as major threats. The British loved it so much they went copycat. Quote, rising aggression from Russia is among top potential threats included in the UK's next national security strategy to be unveiled by David Cameron on November 23. Deterrence or bust. It all gets curiouser and curiouser, or at least muddier, when we remember that roughly a month ago Ash was warning at a meeting of NATO defense ministers in Brussels that Russia would, quote, soon start paying the price for its, quote, escalation in Syria. The price might have been paid via the Metrojet crash. Nothing, of course, links Ash and the Pentagon with it. Wishful thinking at best. No. Okay. If you're looking for something to link Ash and the Pentagon with the Metrojet downing, it's called World Zionism. Okay? Still, the possible bombing of the Sinai branch of Daesh was cracked by GCHQ in London, profiting from its vast We Spy on Everyone NSA-style network. James Bond, Inspector, good old ground intel, would never have had that kind of knowledge. The same meeting in Brussels also decided to boost NATO's so-called spearhead force to, quote, deliver deterrence, in the words of NATO Secretary General Norwegian figurehead Jens Stoltenberg. Stoltenberg even bragged that the sole existence of this force would scare the hell out of Russia, as well as the Syrian Arab Army SAA about alleged incursions into Turkish territory. Still, no NATO force was deployed to Turkey. After all, NATO was too busy invading Spain. We're going to read this supplementary article. This is November 6, 2015, Pepe Escobar for SputnikNews.com. I will note that this is not a satire article. It is not a joke. But those who have been following closely will find the comedic value in this article. From its thunderous humiliation by the Taliban, its, quote, liberation of Libya for the benefit of militia hell, and while Russia was bombing the hell out of a Salafi jihadi moderate rebel constellation in Syria, NATO, in search for a, quote, 360-degree response to Russia, resorted to invading Spain. Again, this is not a joke. And Portugal, and Italy, the whole central Mediterranean for that matter. Trident Juncture, the heroic denomination of NATO's war games, is supposed to last a very long 5 weeks involving 36,000 troops, 230 military units, 140 fighter aircraft, more than 60 ships and Humvees, spectacularly bogged down on Portuguese beaches. Oh yes, it takes a lot of effort to find those elusive, evil tapas of mass destruction. NATO Secretary General Norwegian figurehead Jens Stoltenberg ceremonially landed in Zaragoza to observe Trident Juncture in person. Spinning, there were now, quote, many threats to the south of the alliance. No, he was not talking about himself. Stoltenberg was evidently oblivious to pan-European civil society protesting his weaponized big brother en masse in Zaragoza, in Rome, in Sofia, in Montenegro. Instead, he advanced that in early December NATO will come up with a new southern strategy, essentially more patrols in the Club Med, deployment of NATO troops in advisory roles across Middle East, Northern Africa, MENA, and reinforced permanent NATO military deployments all over Europe. Trident Juncture involves what NATO calls spearhead force. So may the force be fit to invade not only PIGS but all points Africa as well. Maybe we should copy DHL. With Trident Juncture, we have a NATO invasion of some of the PIGS, Portugal, Italy, and Spain, all nasty pejorative connotations included, essentially designed to reassure NATO's eastern allies that Russia will not be able to invade them. After all, Admiral John Richardson, the new chief of U.S. Navy operations, had already confirmed the Pentagon is sending extra ships and submarines to deter, quote, Russian adventurism. He was echoed by General Adrian Bradshaw, NATO's Deputy Supreme Allied Commander, who invoked perennial freedom of navigation to justify an escalation. Quote, as we observed the deployment of more sophisticated Russian capabilities with considerable reach, it becomes more and more important that we refresh our deterrence. So from now on, expect a NATO continuum of deterrence all across southern Europe. That includes 5 Global Hawk surveillance drones based in Sicily that will allow non-stop spying across the Mediterranean to MENA. Predictably, to justify Trident Juncture, Western corporate media turned up the excuse bullhorn to ear-splitting levels, from, quote, wrong-footed U.S.-led alliance to, quote, tactical surprises by Russia, while praising NATO's, quote, biggest modernization since the Cold War. General Denis Mercier from France spun NATO's new multi-layered deterrence effort as, quote, we need to develop a strategy for all kinds of crises at 360 degrees. Well, a few extra degrees towards the eastern Mediterranean would pit NATO against Russia. But that's too risky. Better try to find those tapas. Proverbially unnamed NATO officials were kept busy anyway spinning that Russia could deploy warships from the eastern Mediterranean to Libya to, quote, hamper a NATO, quote, effort to support a future government of national unity. As if NATO's strategy of creating a wasteland in northern Africa and calling it victory would qualify it for nation building. Trident Juncture is all about, well, tapas. The full dinner takes place at a NATO summit in July 2016 in Russia demonizing Poland. Europeans are advised to expect lots of brilliant ideas lifted from DHL and Amazon. Yes, that's Amazon, as in the internet store website Amazon.com. As NATO's Mercier indelibly put it, quote, "We should look at what the civilian world does to DHL and Amazon. How do they improve their logistics?" Oh God, this man is the head of a global military force, and he needs help. He needs help from the civilian sector. Oh, those mysterious Russians. NATO's cluelessness is a direct consequence of American military perplexity, as reflected in this priceless briefing by Dr. Strangelove, NATO Supremo General Philip Breedlove himself. In his own words, "We cannot be fully certain of what Russia will do next. We still cannot fully discern Mr. Putin's intent." And that perplexity in itself reflects the Pentagon's deadly mix of ire and impotence. Take U.S. Army Chief of Staff General Mike Milley, blasting at the Defense One summit in Washington that Russia is, quote, aggressive, quote, adversarial to the interests of the United States, a violator of, quote, the Westphalian Order. Since 2008, by, quote, invading sovereign nations, and in some, fully subscribing to the latest U.S. military doctrine, an existential threat. Breedlove/Hate at least admitted the Pentagon's perennial obsession with supposed full-spectrum dominance, projected way beyond Europe towards MENA and deep into Africa. Quote, "Most of the forces we have in Europe are also dual-hatted to Africa Command. While they are stationed in Europe, their focus is on AFRICOM missions on the continent. In this way, EUCOM is supporting across that stream into AFRICOM." And yet the number one issue in MENA remains Syria. The Pentagon is deploying a dozen F-15C Eagle fighters to Turkey's Incirlik base. The official spin is to, quote, ensure the safety of, quote, NATO allies, which should be translated as protecting U.S. and other coalition of the dodgy opportunists, CDO allied jet fighters, from Russian jet fighters. Theoretically, the F-15Cs will be, quote, escorting the odd CDO attack planes that bomb ISIS once in a blue moon. Rubbish. The F-15Cs carry only air-to-air weapons, and their pilots are trained to only shoot down enemy aircraft. The notion that the Pentagon would dare declaring its own no-fly zone over northern Syria to protect a gaggle of moderate rebels from Russian and Syrian Arab army bombing is preposterous. What next? Red fighters against blue fighters on air-to-air combat, as much as he's cornered by a neocon-infested Pentagon. Obama is not suicidal. That's certainly arguable. Still, the wondrous plot of two divergent coalitions in Syria, the CDO versus the 4+1, Russia, Syria, Iran, Iraq, plus Hezbollah, keeps thickening. Adding to Pentagon freak out, Russia has sent missile systems to Syria on top of fighter jets, bombers, and helicopters, as Colonel General Viktor Bondarev told the Komsomolskaya Pravda, as Bondarev and other Russian military officials have kept mum on what sort of missiles the Pentagon assumes they are the deadly accurate S-300 surface-to-air missile systems. Oh dear. Better scrap that Pentagon no-fly zone. So it's easy to see why the Pentagon and NATO are so dejected. It's so much safer to keep looking for those elusive tapas of mass destruction, and then go for a deterrence siesta. Continuing, we're excused for allowing a Bubba Clinton I feel ya moment as we consider Ash's whining. There are so many we didn't have a clue Pentagon instances he cannot possibly acknowledge on the record. For instance, the performance of Russian-caliber missiles compared to Tomahawks. Launched by the Caspian Sea Fleet, they flew over 1,500 kilometers before hitting ISIS targets, which implies their maximum range, according to Russian military sources, is about 1,800 kilometers. much larger than the Tomahawks. On top of it, each target was hit with only 2 missiles, and in very few cases, 3. This suggests ultra-high precision and reliability, considering that the U.S. usually targets command centers or depots with as many as 4 missiles. Russia has also deployed ultra-sophisticated electronic warfare systems in Syria, such as the Krasukha-4, easily capable of jamming AWACS and satellites. Ash cannot possibly admit on the record Russia de facto controls the skies over Syria. Sultan Erdogan at least was clever enough to understand that his no-fly zone across the Turkish-Syrian border will never fly. What's left is, well, a Vietnam postmodern remix. Send more troops. Ash is enthusiastic as long as the U.S. can find more, quote, capable local forces to partner with. So let's take a look at the, quote, capable local scenario. ISIS/Daesh is active in central Syria alongside Jaish al-Fatah, an Islamist coalition with quite a few members affiliated with Jabhat al-Nusra, aka Al-Qaeda in Syria. In the Hama front lines, the fake, quote, caliphate and al-Nusra are de facto allies. Ash cannot possibly find capable allies here. But there's an enormous back door. Al-Nusra got into camouflage, changing their gear for Ahrar al-Shams, which the Beltway hails as, quote, moderate rebels. Ahrar al-Sham is in fact a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood fully supported by Turkey. Sneaky, sneaky. You're not going to hear anything about this on mainstream TV. So, no wonder everyone wants to join the, quote, moderate rebel bandwagon, hoping to be showered with made-in-USA anti-tank TOW missiles. That includes outfits such as the Brigade Tawhid al-Asimah in Damascus, the Brigade Wa Atasimu, also in Damascus, the Abu Amara Battalion in Aleppo, the Brigade Martyr Ahmad al-Amar, and the Bina Ummah movement, active in Deraa and Quneitra. Working with this lot may be Ash's opening, but that implies sending fresh American troops all over Syria. And now, the 50 Immortals. But first, the Special Forces deployed to northern Syria, Obama's 50 Immortals, need to fulfill their mission. Say one name, Kuwairis. Everything depends on what happens in Kuwairis, a military airbase. Here are the facts on the ground. The SAA, at least for now, has secured its all-important resupply route to Aleppo. What they're aiming for next, supported by Russian airstrikes, is much more complicated. Cut off for good the resupply routes from Turkey for the gaggle of Salafi jihadis, moderate rebels. Arguably, the only local capable force for this mission, and this is the Syrian Kurd YPG. But to solidify their position, the YPG needs to build a strong link between Kobani and the Kurdish enclave of Afrin. And guess why they can't do it? Because the Pentagon is telling them to strike south instead, towards Raqqa, ISIS-Daesh, quote, capital. And Turkish intelligence, which controls the resupply corridor, warned the YPG they will be bombed to oblivion if they try to expand their northern Syria base. So the YPG needs protection to keep moving. It won't come from Ash's people, and the Russians are far away with no boots on the northern Syrian ground. The SAA, though, is only a few kilometers away from Kuwairis. It will be a nasty battle. But if they capture the military air base, they get the perfect hub for Russian and Syrian jets to protect the YPG as they close the gap between Kobani and Afrin. The Pentagon well knows the Russians have made a deal with the Syrian Kurds. The SAA, with as much Russian support as possible, takes Kuwairis. The YPG advances towards Afrin, and the Russians keep the Turks in check. Without this chain of crucial events, it will be virtually impossible for the 4+1, Russia, Syria, Iran, Iraq, plus Hezbollah, to cut off the Turkish-enabled resupply corridor for the myriad Salafi jihadi moderate rebel gaggle. And here's where Obama's 50 Immortals come in. have been sent to the YPG command to, quote, assist them in not fulfilling the deal. What else is new? It makes more sense for Ash's boys to work side by side with Imam al-Zawahiri's goons. That's Imam al-Zawahiri. The Pentagon and al-Qaeda. What could possibly go wrong? Got to keep the global war on terror, GWOT, as much and endless war. Remember Rumsfeld as possible. Now, that's a good reason to stop whining.